We're going to have a good discussion. There isn't a time limit, and like I said, I'm starting a little bit early on purpose, so there's plenty of time. But I'm going to turn this over to Bill Bowman, and he's going to be our MC moderator tonight. But you've got three of the great minds in the beef industry tonight, and I'll let him introduce those. But just know how very thankful that we are to have you all here. It's always a family reunion, and you know, many of you have come here where the wind blows and it's hot and it's dirty and everything, and it's the best it's ever been. So we're excited for you to see that, and we're so thankful that weather combined with the markets, but most importantly, all of you have chose to be with us tonight. So thank you so much, and I give you Bill Bowman.
Thanks, Mark. Well, as Mark said, we're really excited about the folks we've got with us this evening to visit with you. I think any of us that have watched the news over the past several months, we hear a lot of discussion about trade and tariffs and the world economy and trying to understand how it impacts us in not only the beef industry, but across agriculture. And I think we're blessed tonight to have, as Mark said, three real experts in this realm, and we're really anxious to hear from them. I'm going to have them, if they want to come on up here, because we kind of want to keep this informal and try to have a discussion involving the group, and then have a time for some questions afterwards. Just to introduce everybody so you know who the players are on the far end. Yeah, it doesn't.
I'm messing everything.
Nevil. We're okay. Erin Borror is an economist with the U.S. Meat Export Federation, and we're really pleased to have her with us. She travels across the country, around the world, I guess, representing our product, and so we'll hear from Erin. Dr. Glynn Tonsor, many of you in the room probably know, on the faculty at Kansas State University, ag economist that we all see and read a lot, that Glynn does. And then Nevil Speer, who has become a great friend around here, Turkey Track Consulting, I think, the name of his consulting business, been an academic environment for several years, been a consultant, and we see and read a lot that Nevil writes in publications. Mainly, I guess, today we see a couple times a week in Beef Magazine, beef email work, and so we're excited Nevil could be here as well. But I'm going to turn it over to Nevil. You know, he has a great overview of, well, really likes to tell stories and really give people something to think about. And so we thought he'd be a great one to kind of kick off things and kind of give us some background on our topic for tonight. So Nevil?
First of all, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And we are really fortunate this evening because I just asked Glynn, and I've asked Erin earlier, have they ever been on a panel together? And the answer was, they both kind of looked at each other. I don't think so. But you've got two of the best trade people in the country here tonight together. So we are really fortunate to have them, absolutely. So as we kind of talked about doing all of this, as we talk about trade, there is probably no more contentious issue in our industry than that. At least I can tell you those are the ones that I get the nasty grams about, okay? Generally, and or cash trade, okay? Whichever one of those, but it's trade. And in fact, I got 3 from one person this week within the span of about 2 hours. I guess he was really mad, and then he got even madder, and then finally I guess he was really pissed off at the end, and he sent me a 3rd one, right? Okay? So I'm going to kind of start at the very high level, and we'll work our way, kind of dig into more of the details. So just kind of, as we talk about all this, and I do like to tell stories, earlier this spring, as the whole issue of tariffs came up, I began to have a conversation with the gentleman, and I began to talk to him about the data. And he said, I don't care about the data. And I said, really, Gary? It doesn't matter? The facts don't matter? And he said, no, it just doesn't matter. And I was like, okay. Well, actually, I was thankful for that, because it always leads to a column for me, right? So thank you. And so ultimately, I wrote this column called Principles or Protectionism, okay? And I think there's 3 kind of big things that we need to remind ourselves of. And I'll come back to the first one in just a minute. But Henry George, 1800s, okay, if you want to read a lot about trade and trade principles. But he talks about this very concept: political borders possess 0 economic relevance. How many of you from out of state? Yeah, half, 3/4. The state borders mean nothing. You're here for a purpose because it has economic relevance. No one drew the borders of Kansas next to Oklahoma thinking someday there's going to be a bull sale in Ashland, Kansas in 2025, and that's going to somehow matter economically. Okay? The second one is from Hayek, who is a 20th century thinker, economist, who talks a lot about the knowledge problem. That's sort of his claim to fame. And the point being is that we never have central planners who completely understand the ramifications of something they're doing, regardless of what it is, okay? There are always going to be, it doesn't matter what it is, unintended consequences. And then let's back all the way up to that great Scotsman, Adam Smith, who really is the father, the founder of modern day, what we would call capitalism. And in the same tone, he would talk about how complicated economies are and the amazing things that people do. And one of my favorite examples of that is I have a nephew, my wife has a nephew, who owns a small trucking company. And one of the things that he has found a niche in doing and creating value is he hauls bees. Yes, bees. Okay? Picks them up in South Dakota, takes them to California. When they're done with them in California, sometimes they go south, and then ultimately they end up back in South Dakota. Now, not just anybody, they don't just turn anybody loose with a load of bees, right? Okay? But you start up and think about how specialized that is, and how incredible that is, and how important he is to our economy and the fact that we get to eat. Okay? Without that guy hauling bees, we wouldn't have almonds or any kind of fruit or whatever that comes out of California. And so Adam Smith talks about it. This is a chessboard. It's complicated. Okay? Now, with that, I'm going to mess this up. I know it. Some of the cranky people, they'll say, yeah, but this country was founded on self-reliance. Well, I get that. But sometimes we kind of distort history, right? We forget what the founders really stood for. And I think Doug Irwin, in his newest book called Clashing Over Commerce, he says the founders were students of the Enlightenment. They understood Adam Smith, and they understood economic freedom, and that commerce among nations was critical to prosperity. And with that, I would encourage you to go back and read about the Tea Party, right? It was about tariffs and then the removal of tariffs. And the merchants who didn't have access to that were the ones rebelling, right? Again, it's the unintended consequences. And you begin to have central planners doing what they're doing, right? So we often talk about, well, it's taxation without representation. No, it was really about trade and who we get to do business with, okay? So sometimes we mislead ourselves. And you say, well, okay, but what about this? Well, they talked about it. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison. Here are all examples, right, of them talking about trade. Yes, there were tariffs at a point. We had to fund the government somehow, right? We didn't have income tax at that point. But for the most part, and yes, they fought about it. Nothing's ever comes easy in government. But the founders were largely free traders. Open trade, economic freedom, however you want to say that, really important, okay? So these are all examples. Now you can say to me then, well, Nevil, those are just words. They didn't follow through. Yes, they did. The Commerce Clause is absolutely one of the most powerful things in the Constitution. Okay? I would even argue, right, we have a tradition in the United States of making election cakes. I think we should have Commerce Clause cakes. Because the founders clearly understood the principles of free trade, and the last thing they wanted was for one state to be forcing influence on another state over trade. This is really the foundation of the most economically prosperous country ever known to the world. And can you imagine tomorrow buying a bull? Dr. Speer gives you a health paper, and you drive south, and the first weigh station you get to, and they want to check your health papers, they say, sir, we're going to collect a tariff. We don't even think twice about it, do we? And so when you look at this map, we don't think twice about driving from one place to another with some sort of product and thinking, wow, I'm going to get charged because I just brought this across state lines. You just raised your hand, you're from other states. Why do you do that? Because you have economic freedom to come here and do so. You do not want the government ever to tell you where and from whom you can make purchases and or have the government try to influence that. It's really powerful. Okay, now let me just end on this. Most of you, I assume, I do know. These two stickers on the right, there's probably some examples out here in the parking lot of those. Okay? So the first one is from an F-150 that we own, and it is built in Dearborn, Michigan. And so if you have an F-150, it has that sticker on it, doesn't it? Because by law, it's required. That's called the American Automobile Labeling Act. Okay? Now tell me, how much does that tell you about the truck? Other than it was assembled in Dearborn, Michigan. You don't know anything about what percent American or domestic it is, do you? Well, you can actually look it up because the American Automobile Labeling Act requires the companies to look it up. The F-150 right now is about 30% domestic, 70% international. okay? Now the sticker right below that is from not too far from where I live, just up the road in Louisville, Kentucky. It's a sticker from an F-350 that we own that has a Power Stroke engine in it. Can you look up anything about that vehicle? No. It's exempt from the American Automobile Labeling Act because it has a GVWR over 8,500 pounds. Okay? I would suspicion that the F-350 is fairly similar to the F-150 in terms of percentage. But I also know that the F-350 has a Power Stroke engine in it. And it's built in Mexico. Ford has built the Power Stroke engine ever since they went to the 6.7 in Mexico since 2010. Okay? Now, if you don't like that, your alternative is the 7-liter Godzilla gas engine, and it's made in Ontario, Canada. Okay? But clearly, the point being, I've written a lot about country of origin labeling. Glynn Tonsor does the monthly meat demand monitor. Number one thing that consumers look for day after day after day, month after month is taste. That's their number one priority. He ranks 12 attributes. Glenn, I'm not trying to speak for you here, but the bottom one is, in July, origin. And so I get these nasty emails when I start writing about country of origin labeling. Well, consumers have a right to know. I get that. But do they need a government program to tell them that costs a lot of money? Because do they really care? Yes, they care. But generally, those are ranchers who I would say turn around, and I bet a majority of those drive an F-350 Power Stroke. What did you care about when you bought it? Horsepower, torque, durability, fuel mileage, the kind of work it would get done. I have never had a rancher tell me, gosh, I own that Super Duty and the engine was built in Mexico. They don't care to know. The principle's the same, right? So those are things that we need to think about and try to remove some emotion as we talk about trade, and that's really what we're trying to solve this evening. So with that, I'll hand it over to Glynn.
Beautiful. It's always good when the speaker before you uses your resources and you don't have to correct them. So that's always good. Because that's always a little awkward. But we are totally safe there.
Lucky.
So something I want to give you that's actually on this slide here, but to build on what Nevil gave you, is I would argue every person on this planet underestimates how much they currently benefit from international trade. Raise your hand if you brought a smartphone in here tonight. All right, put your hand down. Raise your hand if you know where all the parts were made. You can't. And I don't know the answer to that, right? I don't have the equivalent of the truck details that Nevil gave you. The boots I have here, they are a combination of US and Mexico, and I only know that because my brother lives in Austin, and they're Tecovas. So as I understand it, they're designed in Austin, but they're made in Mexico, all right? We have a long, long list of products we walked into this room with that have multiple countries involved, and you benefit from that, but we don't recognize it, and I would be so bold to say we don't even think about it most of the time. But that's dangerous if you take that for granted, is why I'm starting there, okay? So I would argue we've all benefited from that over time, and in many ways just taking it for granted, and therefore don't fully appreciate the risk of quote unquote messing that up, okay? So what you have in front of you here is a really high-tech picture of a Rubik's Cube, and then a picture of the world split. Most people also don't have a real good appreciation of the relative population around the world. So the Western Hemisphere is one of those globes, and then the rest of the world kind of the other side. And at the bottom here, you can see roughly 15% of the current global population is the Western Hemisphere. Now, not every person pays the same amount for beef and so forth. I'm going to save you from that lecture here. But if we just start with mouths for a moment, outside of the Western Hemisphere is a much bigger market than within it. And I would add, going forward, this population dynamic is even more that way if you think about Africa and so forth, right? And Erin's going to touch on this some a little bit. But the reason I'm starting right here is anything we do that changes the terms of trade in the ag space, and even more narrowly in the beef and cattle space, with some of those folks outside of our hemisphere that might not feel like our neighbors, we are closing either our current or future market. And you're hitting your own wallet whether we know it that day or not. And the point of the Rubik's Cube is you can't turn a Rubik's Cube without moving 2 or 3 things, right? It's interconnected in various ways. And I've never solved a Rubik's Cube, by the way. I mean, it's a very frustrating thing for me when I have a kid throw it at me. But it's very easy to underestimate how interconnected things are. I'll give you a simple example. The tariff discussion on imports from Brazil that we have right now, I could talk an hour about the implications on the U.S. cull cow price and what it means for how big the U.S. beef cow herd might be over the next 5 years. Because the direct tax on how much lean we bring in from Brazil directly impacts the value of lean we get from our domestic culls. It impacts the economic incentive whether to keep that 6 or 10-year-old cow in my herd, and it impacts the number of mama cows we have in the system, okay? We don't usually think about that at face value when we kind of say, yeah, raise the tariff, right? But there's some of these unintended consequences, to use Nevil's terms, that are always there, and I would argue they come back to the ranch level pretty fast, okay? And maybe to scare you a little bit, which might be the real reason I was asked to be here tonight, is I'm an ag economist. They're never fun, so hopefully they bring something else to the table. Myself and Dr. Peel, most of you know Dr. Peel at Oklahoma State, we were asked by the Texas, the Oklahoma, and the Kansas beef councils a few years back to answer the question, what would happen if we didn't trade? Now, specifically beef. So if we just waved a magic wand tomorrow and we did not have any exports or imports, so we just, like the proverbial concrete wall goes up. We don't do either one. So we attempted to quantify that. There's a link at the bottom here that you can pull up. But the punchline I want to drive home to you is when we did this in September of 2022 in an entirely different cattle price market. I don't think I got to tell you how much different the prices were then than now, right? We all know how much higher they are. The net effect we estimate for those selling feeder cattle or fed cattle. This is not a society statement. It's just for the live animal part. And by the way, it's not even seed stock. That's another thing in here we could talk about. Since I'm sitting here, I got to say. But those that sell yearlings and those that sell feedlot cattle, right, 1,500 pounders, summed up to a $20 billion loss. If we decline trade by 10%, which is not the same as just stopping it. You could add a 0 to that by multiplying this by 10 to get a really crude estimate. I'm not willing to do that because these things are very nonlinear and so forth. That's why I'm giving you this example. But I'm doing this on purpose to say we did this work, Daryl and I believe, it would be catastrophic if you had a 10% reduction, right? 20 billion is a big number. And I don't know how much to scale that up in front of you today, but it would easily be a third, and it may well be a half. Again, bigger, given the changes in the marketplace since then, okay? So this 20 billion number I know is too low, is the point of that comment, but hopefully it's big enough that it gets your attention. That trade is very, very relevant, okay? Now, how does this show up? I would argue it's because trade lets markets work, okay? So in the spirit of being, participatory, raise your hand if you had beef tongue last night, okay? Now, the follow-up question for the 3 that might have raised their hand if they just wanted to have fun with me, I was going to ask, did you have organic beef tongue, right? To make a point that I got no hands go up, okay? I'm not above organic beef tongue. I have nothing against it. Don't take my comment that way. But I would argue that's a niche market. The typical person in the US does not value beef tongue. And even in that subset, an even smaller set would be chasing something from the organic versus conventional production system. But you can see here there's an asking price of $10.50 a pound from a grocery store in the US is what I just did this picture from. And I have zero problem with somebody in America paying $10.50 a pound for organic beef tongue if they want. But what I want to impress on you is if we had to sell 25 million or more tongues in the US, organic or not, you ain't getting $10.52 a pound. I would be so bold to say 20, if not 23 million of those would go towards something rendering dog food something else because they would not have value for the typical US household, which pulls the net price a heck of a lot closer to zero than it does 10.52. Why am I picking on tongue? Because I'm pretty sure Erin's gonna make a comment about various products we get, right? It might feel like an extreme example, but the other reason I'm giving it to you is look at the relative price for a Kroger conventional 80-20 ground beef package, which we all would be much more familiar with, right? Most people in this room probably had ground beef in the last week, right? It's sort of a staple in the typical American diet. Asking price of that particular package when I pulled this was $6.33. Why am I highlighting this to you? The asking price is $4 higher for organic beef tongue, yet nobody in here had it, but it was not because of the price, okay? There's more to it than just the asking price in these stories. Economists talk about that. But there's a taste and preference component to this, and the taste and preference poll for beef tongue is in the other hemisphere, going back to my first slide, okay? Particularly in Asian countries, okay? And Erin can give you more detail, but only if we're open to markets do we have that. Otherwise, the market clearing price for beef tongue is a heck of a lot lower. And you could repeat this on livers, you could repeat it on a lot of products, and the net effect of that is how you get with that big loss that Dr. Peel and I came up with across all the products, all the cattle. All right, so now let's get a little bit outside of beef cattle for just a moment. Sometimes when I'm asked to talk about this, and I suspect Nevil would agree with this, it gets confounded in our current political environment and even our current administration. And there is some truth to, we're talking about some of these things in a different way. So tariffs in particular, we're talking about differently than we did in past administrations. But I want to impress on you this discussion about the value of trade, and I would argue the underestimating of the importance of trade in ag is not new. That statement itself is not new. One of the things you have in front of you here is a chart that goes back decades, and the reason I include it is globally, there's been a rise in populism, so questioning the need to be connected to the rest of the world, to use a summary around that. That is not a new thing. For many years, we've had a questioning of the value of being connected globally, okay? That's not something that started this past January, right? Society has been on that trend for some time. There's a picture here from the Economist magazine. I am one of the geeks that reads the Economist quite regularly. And on the front of this is zero sum, and there's a bunch of ships that are organized like the summation sign. So for the younger ones in the room that might be going through a math class right now, this is the mathematic operator summation. And the Economist is trying to remind us and warn us to not have a zero-sum mentality when it comes to trade. And what I mean by that is, don't presume that I make $1, somebody else loses $1, and it's a zero net, right? That's not how most would argue trade works. I would argue trade, quote unquote, rises the boats. We're better off by trading. But I will readily admit to you that economists for a long time, not just in the last few months, but for a long time, have done a bad job of admitting and communicating that there are losers from trade. And both can be true. So I firmly believe society is better off via trade. That iPhone that's in my pocket I asked you guys to hold up and so forth, society's better off because we have trade in aggregate. But whoever was making a phone before Apple came up with the iPhone and got displaced, that individual person or their company probably isn't better off if they're not in business anymore, right? So there are definitely examples of losers that come with more trade. Economists need to be honest and admit that, but it doesn't change the statement that society in aggregate is better off, okay? So the truth is a little more complicated is what I'm trying to tell you, and I think that feeds into some of the confusion around the countryside because we don't admit that there are some losers when you have trade, right? The power stroke not being made in the US, somebody that used to try to make the equivalent in the US that didn't, probably lost in that, right? But the value to society of producing that same engine, if not better or cheaper elsewhere, outweighs that in aggregate, would be my summation around that, okay? I have 2 slides here, and I'll hand this over to Erin. I've done a bunch of work over time on the issue of cage-free eggs and gestation stall use in the pork industry. And why am I giving you those two? Neville hinted at some state-by-state kind of things. I would submit to you that just within our own country, we don't understand and appreciate this notion of trade. And he made this point earlier, but I'm trying to bring it back home again on the ag front. So Proposition 12 is a California thing, and Iowa and other pork producers have some challenges with that. Egg producers in the Midwest have challenges with cage-free mandates and so forth. There's lots of examples within ag, within the lower 48 states of our own country, that are sort of void of this recognition of comparative advantage and the value of trade, in that example cross state, right? Why am I starting there? We don't have to even put the term international in front of it to say we're underestimating the value of trade, okay? When we add the international, the non-US part to that, it gets more political and emotional, but the economic intuition at play is the same if I'm talking Kansas versus California or I'm talking US versus Japan, okay? The number of zeros involved goes up when you talk whole countries, but the economic intuition about why both sides have an interest in doing the trade is generally the same, okay? And this may tick somebody off, but I think I have permission to keep pressing. Here's a slide. You can pull it up later. It's from a survey last August. It's not one of my surveys. You can pull it up. It's from the Cato Group. And keep in mind, this was done before the election. To my comment earlier about not everything is because of the current administration. There's two questions that were asked over time. And if you can't read in the back, I'll read it to you. One of them is, how much do you agree or disagree with this statement? America would be better off if more people worked in manufacturing. And 80% of the respondents in America said, yes, I agree with that. 20% say, I disagree with that. Another question in the same survey, the same population of people, was, do you agree or disagree with I would be better off if I worked in a factory? Please note, only 25% agreed with that, 73% disagreed, and of that sample at that time, 2% said they worked in some kind of manufacturing facility, okay? Now, most important, I'm not here attacking manufacturing. I'm all for it. My hometown had manufacturing. Do not think I'm attacking it. That's not the point. I'm hoping you pick up on the disconnect in these two questions. The top of this is sort of the, I go to the ballot box, what do I support if something's framed a certain way? Hell yeah, it's time for change. But when you put it on the more the I, how would it impact me, dare I say, impact my wallet, some of that excitement disappears, okay? I would argue this is not unique to manufacturing. It's not by accident I'm using manufacturing because it often comes up in broader bring the jobs home discussions. But even we within our own country need to be a lot better about being consistent in the signals we send. Hence this point. Even in this survey, respondents aren't consistent. I would argue in my cage-free egg examples and my gestation stall pork front, we as Americans aren't consistent. We vote for changes we don't want to pay for, okay? Same thing holds here on trade. So ultimately, I would encourage us all to have a mentality about grow the economic pie, and then let's discuss who does what and so forth, right? The size of the pie and resources for the industry. And to do that, we have to have a different mindset, right? That's a pro-growth mindset rather than a, hunker down, put up concrete walls mindset. And embedded in my take on the role of trade, whether it is person by person, state by state, or country by country, is you gotta recognize comparative advantages and we gotta let markets work. And I 100% agree with Nevil's summary about unintended consequences. No policy's ever been designed that didn't have them. That's where if you mess with the market can't work as well as it would without it. And that's why we usually lose in aggregate when we don't necessarily see that coming. So grow the pie and please avoid a zero-sum mentality. And I'll pass the mic to Erin.
And do we get my slides? Oh, thanks. I'm kidding, I can do it. Perfect, thank you. All right, tough acts to follow. Thanks, Nevil and Glynn, and appreciate setting the stage since I come up with a bias coming from Meat Export Federation, right? So let's see. I'll start by, flip these a bit, giving you a quick introduction to the U.S. Meat Export Federation, because we are proudly using some of your producer dollars in these international markets building demand for U.S. beef as well as pork and lamb, so U.S. red meat, each and every day. And it's been a true blessing to work for our industry internationally, and our international staff are phenomenal. So again, we are covering pretty much the world with these representatives, and USMEF is funded from beef, pork, corn, and soy checkoff dollars, as well as some funding through the Farm Bill, through the Market Access Program and Foreign Market Development Programs, and membership fees as well. So some of your checkoff dollars from both national and some that are allocated from states are going to these programs in the international markets. And diving in from kind of the bigger picture, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I see from the USMEF perspective, and try to weave in some of the comments from being at Certified Angus Beef Convention in Austin the past couple of days. So keeping the real optimism in here too, besides some of the trade challenges. But again, we'll go in a little deeper on why exports in particular are so critical, but really I should be framing that as trade is critical to the beef industry. And it's all about maximizing the carcass value. And tongues are definitely a great example, and we'll go deeper on some of that. And we are seeing challenges with our export market access, China in particular, but there are opportunities as well. And so I want to touch briefly on those. And unfortunately for me, I spend a lot of time, Bryce would say way too much time, worrying about China, but that is a loss of $150 to $165 per head currently, because that market is closed. And that's about $4 billion annually that our industry is essentially leaving on the table. So it's a harder message to convey to the government at this moment because they see the high beef prices. So we've just been trying to explain that the packer has record high costs of production, and one of his top customers is out of the market, or he can't sell to them currently. So this is leaving dollars on the table, and including at this time, and I'll talk a little more about that. And then the supply shock, and I think this is a bit underappreciated, but listening to Randy Block from CattleFax, and just watching the numbers so far this year, it's been tremendous, but we have to remember that the Mexican feeder cattle that are not coming into this country, that's about 1 million head that are not entering the US. And Mexican feeders account for 4 to 5% of our kill. So 5% say supply shock, plus that Brazilian beef at now 76.4% tariff. Brazilian beef was going to account for like 5% of our consumption. So you can just say, rough math, 10% of supplies are currently impacted. And Randy was saying, we're in the eye of the storm right now. And to me, that was just a great way to summarize how much the market has jumped. And really, if you look back to like July 7th, when it became clear that we were not going to reopen that market, we reopened it for like 2 days and shut the southern border again to those Mexican cattle. And the market just went, further. So I kind of liked the way Randy framed it up as in the eye of the storm, because we also had those Brazilian 50% tariffs in the works at that time. And really, you haven't even seen the full supply shock yet, because those Mexican feeders would still be on feed. They wouldn't be beef yet. And that Brazilian product can still enter until, I think it was October 6th. There was a pipeline allowance. So product that shipped out before those tariffs were imposed, I think by August 7th or so, can still clear without the additional 50% tariff until October 6th or so. So you're really not seeing the full supply shock, but I think Randy also was very, obviously, clever in his explanation that the market always prices ahead. So he was also trying to reassure the customers, right, the beef buyers, that look, guys, the world's not ending. We are not going to stop producing. We're not going to run out of supplies, and we are in the eye of the storm right now. And this markets always look ahead and are pricing ahead. And you've maybe started to see some of that with the futures pulling back a bit. I am not going to claim the top, and Randy also wasn't willing to do that. But it does just remind us maybe that we have so many of these external factors that are really impacting us and directly in our markets now. So looking specifically at the export side, I know don't worry about the numbers. I really just wanted to show you our top markets so far this year. And actually, so our exports so far are running down 8%, 8%. But if you back China out and leave China out, we're flat. So really, outside of the closed market of China, those international customers are still hanging in there. And they're paying record high prices, although there's some nuance there, because without China competing for the cuts that China buys, which I've listed here, the prices for those products are actually a bit soft. And so again, that's where that leaving or losing $150 to $165 per head comes in, is because the value of China is that China is such a huge market that if I'm a buyer in Japan and I know China could come in and buy everything, I'm willing to pay more. And same for Korea, same for Taiwan, same for Southeast Asia. They know when China's in the market, China could just suck everything up. So they will pay higher. They will drive. Having China in the market drives that short plate to $4 a pound instead of $2. So it's the short plate, it's the chuck short ribs, the rib fingers, top blade, omasum, aorta. We might eat a tongue if we served it tonight, but you're probably not going to go for the omasum, just a guess. And that omasum is at a premium to a lot of muscle cuts in the China market. So that's the value, and that's the message that we've been trying to convey, is that even in times when we are a net importer of beef, we must be able to export. And we still have to capture the full value of every animal, and having those international customers is the only way we can do that. And again, we're highly specialized. So when we're exporting corn and beans, there's not a big difference between what goes to the international and what stays here, right? But on beef, we are exporting very specific cuts to the markets. And so again, heavily out of both ends, but especially here again, oops, sorry, not that button, especially for the plate and our short ribs, some of these chuck items, and then out of the round to Canada and Mexico. So highly specialized in what we export. And these Asian markets especially, they love our highly marbled beef. And so now that we're producing record volumes of prime, needing access to these markets that really want that fatty product, and prime short plate can be a challenge, honestly. That's a cut, the belly, that you don't necessarily need all that fat. So we really need these Asian markets. And the offal is the easy story to tell. And clearly, again, I tell people my sister would have us all eat liver for breakfast because it's a nutrition powerhouse, but we're probably not going to do it. So we do need these international markets. And again, just the quick summary, if we look at the export value compared to head slaughtered, you have those tongues from Japan averaging $15.60 for every head last year. So tremendous value in these variety meats, and on the whole, they were $43.55 per pound. And Mexico, Egypt, South America, really around the world, China also being an important customer, again, especially for omasum and those stomach products. The other way of looking at the value of exports is that we've continued to see a larger dollars per head. So it's just a way of tracking how well exports are performing against production, essentially, and to try to make exports more understandable rather than saying $11 billion. So we are here at $404 per head this year, even without the China market. But I've noted in July we were off $50 per head because we're missing that China number. So shipments to China plummeted in especially May, June, July. And so it is starting to reflect. And also, even in times of past cycles, we don't really get below 13% of production going to export. Once we regained access following BSE, So remember, it was a long haul to get our markets back after BSE, but once we did, we really haven't dipped below this 13%, and this includes variety meats. So again, that international customer is critical even in times of tight supply, and I would actually argue even more so in times of tight supply, because remember, your packer has record high cost of production, and he must max the value of every animal. Another way of looking at it is this export premium. So if we look at the export price against the import price, we set new records as far as that export premium last year at $1.14 per head. And this year, that's pulled back a little bit, again, without that China market. So you do see a bit softening of prices, especially if we look at it on a monthly basis, where that premium has dropped because, again, these export prices have actually eased off a bit without that China bid in there. So to me, it just tells you, again, how specialized these exports are. And when you miss a top customer, you really have an impact. Another thing, and I think this plays into both Nevil and Glynn's comments on the unintended consequences and how everything really is connected. So for example, one thing that we're already seeing with the 50% tariff coming on Brazil and with the knowledge that that was going to happen, Brazil is shipping more into Mexico. And this was already underway. It's not like this just started. It was already underway, but this 50% tariff into the US has just fueled more Brazilian shipments into Mexico. And what's startling to me is that Brazil is now the largest supplier of beef. So I backed out variety meats. If you include variety meats, the US is still number one. But without variety meats, just looking at the beef, Brazil is now the top supplier into Mexico from nothing. You can see they weren't even there prior to last year, looking at first half anyway. So they've gone from not being in the market to now the top supplier, feels like overnight. And this is important because Brazil's supplying lean into the Mexican market. Mexico likes lean. Mexico is our dominant taker of gooseneck rounds, for example. So now we're up against this Brazilian product in Mexico, and so you start seeing those knock-on impacts. And like Glynn was saying, I mean, the implications for our cow market, definitely. I mean, there's so much here to shake out. But for us, watching the international specifically, again, immediately seeing that Brazilian product in the Mexican market and what's that going to do for goosenecks as well. Our higher-end customers in Mexico, certified Angus beef customers, are still performing great. So that segment, Brazil, we don't compete with Brazil. And typically, I would tell you we don't compete with Brazilian product. But on these goosenecks into Mexico, that's going to be an impact. And then another thing that's frustrating. So we've watched coming back from BSE. I remember being in the Korean market and going into Costco and seeing clean and safe Australian beef on the wall and wanting to cry. And the day I walked in there and saw the USDA Choice Shield on the wall, it was like the best day ever. So China is similar. We were out of the China market until the Phase 1 agreement in the first Trump administration. So March of 2020, we got real access into the China market for the first time since 2003. And we quickly became the top supplier of grain-fed beef into China. So luckily, your team, our team on the ground in China had been working that China market the whole time. We never left. And so that customer in China, they had some experience with US beef. They know the Hong Kong market. So we were on top of it immediately, and the trade started flowing rapidly. So it wasn't maybe as difficult as Korea, where we had candlelight protests in the streets before we came back in that market. But still, we watched the growth into Sam's Club, for example. So chilled US beef into Sam's Club, killing it, absolutely killing it. And now Australia is number one again. So Sam's Club had to switch to Australian beef. They've actually done more marinated products, more value-added products to compensate for the lack of quality, because nothing beats American beef. So it kind of warms your heart in a way that they've had to do some things to cover up for the lacking quality, and they will switch back to US as soon as they can. That's at least the message we're getting at the moment, but for now, we're watching Australia take the market back yet again. So when I was in Australia in April, I started my presentation with "You're welcome," because they were all in a huff about what was America doing, and I said, "You're welcome. Enjoy the world markets. We're going to shoot ourselves in the foot for a while and have fun." And they have very high prices, not record, but very high prices. They're pricing up to us. They're benefiting from the demand in this market, no question, and they have record production. So the competition is nipping at our heels, unfortunately, and that's something we have to remember as well. Just to kind of end here on the quality story, so again, U.S. beef always sells at a premium into these world markets, and we are choice and prime. We are the best. Of course, if I'm in Japan, Wagyu is the best. If I'm in Korea, Hanwoo is the best. But as far as imported product, we compete with Australian Wagyu, is basically where we're at. And again, we are premium. We've also seen tremendous growth in our free trade agreement countries. And so we've also been reminding, look, trade has been beneficial. The U.S. has benefited, especially American agriculture. And I also like to remind us that there are different tastes and preferences. So again, we talked about variety meats, but even just thinking about the thin cut markets, the grill at the table, that is Japanese and Korean kind of style barbecue, that requires highly marbled beef. So there's a reason why these countries are such tremendous demand for our products. And another thing that I like to highlight is just the creativity. So when I go to Korea, that market is always changing, always changing. I don't think my Costco changes a whole lot. Costco Korea is always innovating. There's always new products at the deli. There's always new value-add products. Just huge creativity. And they're excellent at merchandising our beef. And there is this trend underway right now, too, on imaging up. So I am really excited for things like certified Angus beef because we're seeing, for example, in Taiwan, Costco is pairing up with Uber Eats, which they talk about consumers not wanting to spend money, and I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? Costco's pairing up with Uber Eats? I think we're still spending money. And one of their banner items is certified Angus beef. So there is an effort to image up. In Korea, Coupang, which is the major e-commerce company, certified Angus beef, banner product. So even in the convenience realm, across whatever stores, they are imaging up and capturing that higher end consumer. And our product, and certified Angus beef in particular, is a key part of that. There were many international award winners on stage at certified Angus beef, and there's huge excitement about our product. So I think my ending message is just you're doing the right thing. Stick with the quality, keep providing the quality beef. Again, the competition is they want to do what we're doing. Every country where I'm reading the summary reports from USDA, our foreign ag service that are posted in these markets, they're all saying more grain finishing. Like the competition is trying to do what we are doing because we've been successful. They see the value here. They see the demand for high quality products. So want to end on that positive note, and I will leave it there and turn back to Bill. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Mark.
Let's give. Well, we appreciate the panelists and great information to get started. Erin, I was going to ask real quickly, how much is your organization involved in dealing with the administration on some of these ideas and policies to try to influence your trade?
I don't know how much I want to admit this. Well, if you ask how I spend my time, a lot. So I'm on the ATAC, which is a cleared advisor. I'm a cleared advisor to help hopefully inform the U.S. Trade Representative and USDA about what we need on trade. So feeding into them regularly, basically on a daily basis. This administration has actually solicited a lot of input from industry. So I have provided cleared comments on many, many topics. So they certainly want to hear from us. I've also been in meetings there where they wanted our input. So I will definitely give that to the administration. And I do believe they're trying to do the right thing. I think I have to work even harder. We have to work even harder to help them understand how all of this interconnectedness and their unintended potential consequences. But yes, I'm not a lobbyist. I don't lobby, but I work as a trusted, dare I say, partner to try to inform on the facts and take exporters to meet with them as well. So let them talk to the people that are actually doing the business.
Bill, I think we're still on. I'm a proud American before I give you the next comment, but I am a cold-hearted economist, so keep that in mind. I think one of the challenges we have in America is Erin and USMEF more broadly, and entities like USMEF, sort of every 4 years, or maybe every 2, depending on what part of the political election cycle we're talking about, have to start over on their education and training efforts, right? So regardless of your politics and regardless which way you lean, it's not uncommon. There's a new set of folks that are involved here. And the majority of what we're talking about tonight are multi-decade long comparative advantages that are built out, right? So U.S. beef cattle has a global place because of the grain-fed marbling, right? But we didn't build that overnight, right? This ranch wasn't built overnight. There's lots of versions of this we could talk about, but a lot of the political decisions and the education effort has a 2 or 4 year cycle with it. And regardless of your leanings, we need to recognize that's an expensive setup that we have as society.
Nevil, you have any?
Well, and maybe not quite directly to this topic, but I think it's important we come back to this. And Glynn just mentioned it. And you look at the dollars. The export side of it's pretty easy to figure out, right? We win in the global marketplace. We want all of that we can get. Okay, so 2 parts to that. One, it's never one-sided. You can't just export and not import. But I would also say a big part of what we do, we can talk about ribeyes and tenderloins and what have you. We produce a lot of ground beef in this country. And it's darn good, right? We like it. There's nothing better than a hamburger. And we forget that every steer produces 150 pounds of 50-50 trim. And we are one of the unique industries. I actually can't think of another industry that just like us, that all those imports, most of them that come in, get blended to that 50-50 trim to make ground beef. And if it weren't for that imported product, that 50-50 trim would be sitting on the floor basically worth nothing. And that takes a lot of dollars out of your everyday bid from a packer, maybe to the tune of even $10 a hundredweight. We forget that this is an industry that benefits from free trade, open trade, economic freedom, both ways, like no other industry. Sometimes I just want to say, just pull your hat down, hunker down, and be quiet, right? Let it go. So, yeah.
Well, again, I'll make these brief, but I don't have this paper I can share with you because it's in process. But James Mitchell is a fellow economist that's at the University of Arkansas, and he's lead on an effort, and I'm on it. And to go further with what Nevil just said, is up until 2023, so it's historic data through 2023, as beef imports grew, it was supportive of domestic fat cattle, so fed cattle leaving a feed yard, but it was depressing on cull cow. Yep. Why? It's exactly what Nevil just told you. Because the majority over time of what we've imported was highly lean to augment 50% trim. You're adding value to to the value of slaughtering those steers and heifers of our feed yards. So it was supportive of the price there. But at the margin, you were putting downward pressure on cull cows because you were displacing some of the lean we got from there. Okay? So back to my comment about the truth is complicated. There's both supportive and non-supportive price stories there. But what's really important to appreciate is over 80% of the income for the cattle industry is tied to the fat cattle market and the drive from that on your calf crop, and maybe 20 from cull cow. So the net of those is quite clear, okay?
Great comments. And again, Mark really wants to give you all an opportunity to pick the brain of experts like this, and that becomes really something we enjoyed having the opportunity to answer questions, invoke additional discussion. So if anybody has comments, we've got a couple mics. We'll try to get those to people. But anybody have a question out there they'd like to ask?
Where do you see the biggest opportunities for the U.S. For U.S. beef in the global marketplace in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's perfect, since I didn't get into that point at all, even though I had it as one of my bullets, so thank you. the way that I've been framing this up, at least in my mind, is, well, maybe just backing up one step. We have such a demand-led market. So we've obviously seen the supply impact, especially since like April. But we have had a really demand-led market. And that is tremendous. I think we all need to remember that. That is absolutely incredible. And actually imports, you could argue, have played into that, because imports, they're accounting for like 18% of consumption. It's actually gotten huge. But that consumer is paying more to have the same pounds per capita. That's demand. So demand has been incredible. And we see it on the international front too. And I could take this many directions, but I think playing on the reciprocal trade agreements piece that I didn't elaborate on at all, a part of the world that has low beef consumption today, very low, and growing incomes, younger population, growing population, which is kind of rare now, that part of the world is Southeast Asia. And they also have, they love Korean influence. Korea is my model market, that's why I showed it. And so this part of the world, they're heavily influenced by Koreans, by Korean cuisine, pop, Korean K-pop, whatever, all of it. And they already have some flavor for U.S. beef. We are in some of these markets anyway, and we just got back in Indonesia, which is tremendous. But we are at huge disadvantage in the region. We have Australia and New Zealand have free trade agreements. They have zero tariffs into all of these markets. So Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, across the board. Thailand has a tariff of 50% on U.S. beef, for example, and Australia is at zero. And there are a bunch of non-tariff barriers as well. And that is something that this administration is working very hard on. And actually, I should call this out too. U.S. Trade Rep, one of the gals that I speak to like daily, she said, Erin, I thought about getting a mattress to put under my desk. These folks are working their tails off. Like, there is no weekend. No weekend. Our chief ag negotiator, Julie Callahan, she said, I don't even know what a weekend is anymore. So these folks are working so hard. So I also need to emphasize that. But they are trying to address the non-tariff barriers. And those are the complicated, entrenched, miserable issues that are facility registration, product labeling, halal, all of these issues that our exporters deal with, and they're trying to get some of that resolved. So for the reason that we're disadvantaged today and there's low consumption and great potential, I'm going to go with Southeast Asia as my winner. But there's potential around the world.
Bill, I want to run on one thing that Erin just said. She talked about demand. And this has been a demand-driven market. And look, I'm 60 years old. I'm starting to sound like the old guy, right? And I'm looking around the room, and there's young people. We worked as an industry. We've worked our tails off to get to this point. It's better than ever. And I bet if I asked you all when you've gotten your checks selling your calves, you'd be like, I never dreamed I would get this much money. We forget from whence we come. And we need to continually remind ourselves how we got here, because it is an incredible story. So thank you for bringing that up.
And I agree with all that, but to go further, the challenge is, yesterday at a different meeting, I was reminded of the Kodak company. The reason I'm interjected it was Kodak was an industry leader, and my assessment of that situation was failed to recognize their market was changing and didn't adjust, and then woke up one day and was quote unquote irrelevant in the photo camera world, right? I'm not forecasting that for beef tomorrow, don't take it that way. But it is a word of caution that don't take the current, very strong, 100% agree demand environment for granted. Be careful we don't have incentives in place that don't let us fully leverage it, is what we're all three alluding to in different ways tonight. I hope we don't have a Kodak moment anytime soon, but there are industries that go under because they don't recognize the game is changing, so to speak, and you need to recognize that. And if I could point to one domestically, this is not an international point, but generationally, our room here today, there are some younger folks, and I'm thrilled they're here, but every ag group I go to is older than the average in America. That's not a new statement either, but it's very easy for us to not recognize that younger generations approach food differently, not just beef. And the real simple one would be is they have more than 3 eating occasions. They don't want to spend as much time prepping. because they're going to eat more than 3 times. So the value of convenience and a smaller portion size is of increasing importance domestically, not just abroad. And the beef industry, as long as like the whole protein industry, I'd argue, is going to make pivots that way. But I'm highlighting it because if we don't do that, it's a little bit of the Kodak moment, because the young folks that are coming up expect something different than the people that are currently paying a lot more for ribeye that might be 65. We got to know that going forward.
Good. Other questions? Okay.
Many importing countries are requesting source verification and traceability. How close are we to using DNA-based systems to verify genetics, quality attributes, and origin for our export partners?
I'll give you the cop-out comment, is because we're looking at each other, is that's sort of a technical where we're at, feasible question that I can't answer. In the spirit of tonight's comments, I would argue we'll get that technical ability before we'll have consensus to use it. Correct. And I'm being very blunt here on purpose. Scientific ability to do it is sort of step 1. That's a necessary condition behind your question, but it is not sufficient. And let me give you an example. It has nothing to do with trade for a moment, but E. coli vaccines for the cattle industry, those exist. Like the ability to administer a vaccine that reduces shedding. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't use them. I'm just saying the scientific ability to do that exists, but there was not a market environment or incentive to do it. So the scientific breakthrough alone is a necessary but not sufficient point to the heart of your question. And there's a lot of things that go beyond the scientific ability to whether that would see the light of day. I want to be an optimist and say that that could occur, and I think it could for certain companies and certain relationships, but for a whole industry, call me skeptical.
Yeah, and I would just add that, again, in the Asian markets in particular, where they've had traceability for a long time, and they have a spot where you can walk up and like scan the barcode and see all the information. And obviously now in the modern era, you just take your cell phone and scan the QR code and learn all the things. But what they would always say is that it's there, but nobody uses it. So to me, I think this comes kind of to Glynn's survey data too, but the customers, they want taste and quality, and we see this around the world as well. And it doesn't mean we don't tell the story. We absolutely do that all the time. So the kind of sustainability messaging points are in there, but more importantly, the story is in everything that we do in every market. But when I sat across from the major retailer in Korea, I asked him, do you need more on sustainability? And he said, no, I need quality. That's my focus. That's why I'm buying American beef. That's why we want more of it. So I think we just also need to be careful about what we think the consumer wants. Now, traceability for animal health purposes, absolutely. Like foreign animal disease is no joke, and we should be very aware of the risks there, obviously with screwworm on the southern border, but also lumpy skin in Europe, blue tongue, foot and mouth, all of it in Europe, kind of alarming. So that whole, like to me, they're very different though. Animal health, insurance policy, thinking, and consumer, very different.
Going back to your screwworm that you were talking about, how could that affect us in the first quarter going into this new year?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and we probably all have thoughts on that. I think for us, our international staff, we are starting to get some questions about it, and as you can imagine, the materials out there, the fact sheets out there, they're all producer focused, that makes sense. This is a producer issue. So we've been trying to explain to our international staff that it is a producer issue. There's no food safety issue, full stop, absolutely no food safety issue. And livestock trade is impacted, thus the closed border to Mexican cattle, horses, everything. So the livestock trade, definitely an impact, but there is not to be an impact on meat trade. And the WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, that code is very specific, that there's to be no impact on meat trade. Does it mean everyone follows the guidance? No. So I'm not saying we are totally not at risk, because the bad actors could still do something. But we are really trying to focus on the fact that it's not a food safety issue. Supply side, this is where it gets interesting for a number of reasons, including when the Mexican border with the U.S. actually reopens, but also if, heaven forbid, we get it. To me, the most terrifying thing is calving season, honestly, and the risk there with navels and flies, which I was watching APHIS webinars when we were calving in the fall, and I was freaking out, so. I know that Texas estimates are huge as far as loss risk.
I think also the other thing that's interesting in all of this is once you stop markets, it is, right, you stop flow, everybody adjusts. It's very hard to restart those. I think even if we start releasing sterile flies, and it's a 2-year process before we get there, there's going to be a lot of surveillance required. So I foresee us, for whatever that's worth, it's a long time before we're going to see cattle coming across the border from Mexico. And then all of a sudden the business starts to readjust and all the supply issues. I think the scary part is I'm actually not worried about the cattle bringing the screwworm, right? They get dipped, they get inspected. It's the wildlife that we have to worry about. It's going to be, and I've got veterinarians sitting in here, so I'm talking way out of school here, but it's going to, that's really the challenge, is on the wildlife side.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. And I think what's frustrated our government is that the cattle movements that Mexico is still allowing, and they've been pretty clear about that. Secretary Rollins was very clear in the press release last week. So that's part of the reason that the border is closed. The APHIS is confident in the protocol that they negotiated for those cattle to move, but Mexico is still not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's why this border is closed, because whether they initially wouldn't let planes land, to then we had another cattle movement. That's why this fly is now only 70 miles from the Texas border. Is because it was an animal that moved from the feed yard that was infected, or an area that was infected, to a lot that's supposed to be controlled. You can't do that. So that will be another impact if we get it here, is you will have livestock movement controls and that impact as well, which can be significant, obviously. And the other thing that I think is hard to quantify, so there should have been 1 million plus of these feeder cattle moving to the U.S. that are not. Those cattle still exist, obviously. I would argue that Mexico had really tight supplies already because they had been in severe drought, and we saw Mexico buying a lot of beef, pork, poultry, everything. So I think numbers were tight. But the frustrating thing is Mexico's been moving these cattle from Nicaragua, and that's why the fly got there in the first place. So again, the frustration of you shouldn't be having these cattle movements. But if there's 1 million head down there on some kind of feed now, Mexico should produce more beef and export more beef to the U.S. This is going to take time, but that's something that's going to be playing out as well. So again, those cattle didn't go away. I think the numbers were tight, but we will see more Mexican beef production.
Matthew?
So even with this large beef demand, how much do you think the lower supplies with the screwworm closing the border is driving the price of cattle?
I think it's significant. I mean, I will not put a number on it, but again, that was 4 or 5% of our kill when you're already in a. So we have not had a beef supply shortage. We've had a cattle supply shortage. Again, now beef is tightening up too, but until a few months ago. And when you look back and put it on July 7, when we had pretty firm clarity that the border was staying shut, you did see the extra leg up. So again, if you use Randy's words, where the market looks ahead, prices ahead, that's been the shock.
Two things come to mind, and I want to purposely separate 2025 versus 2024 for a moment on this, because it's real simple to make my 2024 point. In 2024, we saw higher prices, not the rate of increase in 25, but nonetheless, higher prices, and more beef went through the market, okay? Lesson number one is that was a demand story. That's not supply gave us higher prices, that's demand gave us higher prices. Why am I starting there? I'll say the domestic beef demand story was quite good going into 2025. I mean, I've been concerned it'd fall apart for years, and it hasn't, right? So I am that pessimistic dude. But you got to remember that was demand-led. And I'm starting there before we even really have the screw room discussion, because that was the base kind of environment that's been pretty good despite a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty, okay? More recently, I think there's some supply side support, but I would actually defer to it's a little bit more demand than we give it credit for, even today, because of that. And the other point I would say is, even if it is a supply-driven, quote-unquote, run-up, nobody's making anybody pay these prices. We don't have the world's best markets. I mean, there's room to improve our capitalistic system, but nobody's making anybody do it. So there's some faith that I'm going to be able to sell what comes next in the supply chain, right? And that, I would argue, that's not just supply. You wouldn't do that if you didn't think there was a decent demand environment to absorb it, right? Just because something might be less available 6 months from now, it doesn't mean I got to pay up for it, and I won't unless I think I can move it, right? So I would argue it's demand-led, and supply has magnified it recently, but it would be in that order.
Dr. Speer.
So I'd like to make a couple comments about screwworm. That was solved before I can, the first time around was solved before I can remember it. And I was probably 4 or 5, I think, but I don't remember it. And I need to talk to my dad, he's 101, to ask him what he remembers. But today, we have more capability. I'm firmly convinced that the screwworm deal is a deal, but it's not as big a deal as things that we need to be concerned about, and we can get our arms around it. I just talked to a lady that's 70 miles from the Mexican border, which is 70 miles, 140 miles away, and she's prepared. She's diligent. We're looking for it. There's more education. That's not something that we need to fear. It's a challenge because we can't import cattle from Mexico. That's a challenge. But it's not something for all of us to get up in arms around. We as producers in the middle of the United States need to be more concerned about, we can control BVD. We need to be concerned about the movement of filaria, a disease in Virginia that's moving west with ticks that's uncontrolled. We don't know about that. There are things that we can control, and I would urge us, don't be up in arms about the New World screwworm. We'll solve that. Wildlife is probably a challenge, but we're going to solve it. And I just want to be encouraged by it because the people in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, they're ready. So I congratulate the USDA for helping us educate us to do that.
I want to comment to that. Dr. Speer, those are amazing comments. And I actually just listened to a podcast yesterday about how they create the sterile flies. I hated entomology in college. And now I regret that, right? Okay? Because I learned so much, and I encourage you to go learn the process and how it goes. And it is amazing, and they've got it under control, and they know what to do. It's just a matter of ramping up and taking time, and they're going to get there. But I think he makes a great point, and actually kind of back to Glynn's point, it is so easy, and it makes me crazy, this fear-mongering around everything that happens. Again, this is not to take our eye off the ball, this is the greatest time ever in our industry. And so actually, now's the time, use that to focus on what really matters. And I think, Glynn, that's where you were bringing us back to is it's good now, but we got to keep our eye on the ball and the consumer and what's going to happen instead of worrying the fear mongering, right? So Dr. Speer, I think it's a great point.
Great. One more here, Mark.
So I sold my first fat steer for 38 cents a pound. I'm a little older than you are. So I have great perspective on that. There's two things I want to say. You haven't said anything about the effect, any of you guys, on the lack of Mexico cattle to our packing industry, and if we lose another packer, how that's going to cripple all of us, not just some of us like those of us from Texas. That's one thing. A second thing is our feed yards, particularly our southern feed yards, are greatly impacted. And if we lose capacity, feeding capacity and packing capacity, things are going to be way different than they are today. You haven't said anything about that, Mr. Economist. So, and then the other thing that I have to say that troubles me, frankly, is the idea that you're bearish based on this trade situation with our current administration about our future in the beef business. So I'd like you to share remarks about both those things. Neville, I agree with you. This is the greatest time in my lifetime to be excited about the beef business. We're creating generational wealth. You can sell cattle now and buy land, and that's never happened in my lifetime. So I think it's a little bit foolish to say the world's about to fall because China, who has done a lot of stuff to the U.S. illegally and fraudulently, is having their feet held to the fire now. So I'd like you to comment on all those things.
So I think I was called out, so I'll go first. And there is a lot there, but I 100% agree with the screwworm, thoroughput, physical capacity concern, and I've said that elsewhere, so I don't disagree with that. And here in South, it's a bigger concern than north of here, right? But to connect it with the unintended consequences of policy theme, I would argue this country invested a few years ago to increase physical capacity in packing that's going to make what you're talking about worse. We already were on the path of having, you could argue, more physical capacity for killing cattle than we had cattle. And what we're talking about with the screwworm threat, right? How long it goes on in the short term, that's the issue, right? So I would remind us that no policy is free of unintended consequences, right? Both state and federal efforts to increase capacity made that particular issue worse. This is my first response to that, okay? To the world's ending kind of comment, no. I hope you didn't take that from me. To pick on maybe Erin's point, if we had a different trade environment, I would argue your prices be even better. That's hard to get across in a historically high market because it's an unobservable, and academics talk about unobservables. I know that, I get that, but I think there's 100, if not 150 bucks per head in every feed yard today that you're not seeing because of those challenges. So it'd be even better is the point. So therefore it's worth understanding, okay? And to the second point is, yes, it's good now, and I'm thrilled the environment's such you can go buy land, but please remember my Kodak comment. Just because it's good now, you can't take that as gonna be the norm all the time, right? And some of our policies, I would actually argue, are not helping, and you'd be in an even better environment if we didn't have them. So I hope that helps.
So just a couple quick comments, and first of all, relative to Mexico, you're exactly right. It's really amazing when you go spend a day down at Santa Teresa and you watch the cattle, and right, it's the feed yards down there, it's the trucks. And by the way, I've always argued, people complain about these cattle getting imported, but you know who makes money off those cattle getting imported? American cattle producers. They're feed yard owners, right? It's truckers. It creates jobs. There is a sale barn right next to the import station. You can run them across the fence, the border fence, and over to the sale barn directly. That's been shut. Somebody owns that, okay? It's a big deal, right? It's definitely a real economic impact. I'm not arguing that we should be bringing cattle in from Mexico. I'm just saying those are the unintended consequences. Right, we've been using that term a lot tonight. I would say the other thing, and I hear your point relative to China. I would also argue the other side of that, and this is where it gets challenging, okay? China doesn't always play straight, but sometimes when we just hit them with a great big stick, we look what's happening to our own producers in agriculture. The China bid is out of the soybean market. And now all of a sudden what we're going to do, the administration's decided, and I'm not, saying yay or nay on administration, because everyone gets all ruffly about everything, right? You know. But is that what we want to be doing? Do we want to be putting tariffs here and then giving money back to producers like we're Santa Claus? I think that creates a lot of unintended consequences, because now all of a sudden we've got the government influencing the market. Because guess what? If I'm a big farmer and I'm getting a big payment from the government, I might change the way I market grain. Therefore, it influences buyers. Therefore, it influences feed prices. It influences cash rent. It influences equipment costs. It's Glynn's Rubik's Cube. It's complicated. And so I think really the whole essence of what we're trying to get to tonight is we need to have these conversations without any kind of emotion, right? So I appreciate everything you bring up, and I'm with you there. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I'm not going to tell our government to open the border with Mexico because the animal health issue, that's not my issue. But China, that whole message is these packers are losing money without access to the Chinese market. I'm not standing on what China should or shouldn't do, but we are being penalized just like we were the first time around as well. So yes, there may be payouts to the commodity crop farmers, but there's not going to be any payouts to the packers. I can pretty much guarantee that. So the message that I've been trying to make is that I can't maybe show you a chart today, administration, that shows the negative impact, except you can see it in the prices for cuts that we export. They are under pressure compared to other cuts. So that's one way to look at it. But not having access to China is a loss for that packer, and it just adds to the list, including not having access to the Mexican cattle, of having plants close. And then we, as a whole industry, share that impact when that leverage flips hard. A few years down the road, we rebuild, plants aren't there, leverage hard shift, and here we are again. So that's just the harsh reality of the structure of our industry. But absolutely, these supply shocks are no joke, and they will have ramifications.
Great comments. Well, we appreciate our panel. Let's give them another round of applause for what they were able to share with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
We thank you all so very much. And, you know, we bring these topics to learn and to connect the dots, and we talk a lot about connecting the dots here. But, you know, I often get calls and go, well, what's your best one? So it's complicated. We have to define what's best. But we're a part of the world, and I think what we all want is just a fair opportunity to compete. And these people are working so hard to make sure that we understand that. And I will end it on that we are living in the greatest time in the history of the beef industry. So we're so thankful for all of you. We will start at 9 a.m. sharp. There's still a little bit of sunlight left. Greg will turn the lights on if you'd like. But thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for your questions, your interest, and just all the good things you do to help to make the world a better place. Thank you.